Medical assistance in dying, it was sold to us as a way to help people at the end of their lives who were dealing with terminal illnesses, but it's expanded well beyond that. Now, one conservative MP says he's worried about what it means for people with mental health. Hi, I'm Brian Lilley, political columnist with the Toronto Sun. Joining me to discuss his concerns is conservative MP Andrew Lawton. He represents the Southwestern Ontario riding just outside London. And Andrew, you and I have known each other long enough that I remember when you were going through your own struggles. This is what, 2009, 2010. You say that if medical assistance in dying were available to you back then, you wouldn't be here today.
That's certainly my belief. Starting around when I was a teenager and into my early 20s, I dealt with depression. I dealt with mental illness, and it was serious enough that on a couple of occasions, but one very serious one in 2010, I attempted to end my life and nearly succeeded. And, the result of this was that I was in the hospital on life support and in a coma for several weeks. And after that, I was able to finally get back on the right track and have the life that I have today, which I'm so happy with and so proud of. But for years, I was operating under the assumption that there was no hope, that life could not get better, that I could not be happy, that I could not beat what I was dealing with. And given what we've seen about how some of the medical assistance and dying processes have unfolded, I am very convinced that I would have been attracted to that process and may well have succeeded in navigating through it with the rules that are going into effect in 2027, which will expand the eligibility so that people who have only a mental illness, so not any physical ailment whatsoever, will be eligible for MAID. And this has prompted a private member's bill by my colleague Tamara Jansen, which will halt this expansion before it comes into effect. And I've been, just given my own background here, throwing my full support behind this.
So take us back to that time, because I met you through the blogosphere.
Mm-hmm.
For people who were online in the early 2000s, blogging became big, and you ran a fairly successful blog. You were an online influencer. We didn't use that term back then, but you were. And you didn't have the broadcast career and now the political career that you do now, but you were building yourself a name, a brand. Things seemed to be going well. And then you kind of disappeared. And I had to reach out to a mutual friend, now passed, Kathy Shadle, and say, where's Andrew?
Yeah.
What's going on? And that's when I found out what you were dealing with. But the simple fact is, you looked fine on the outside. Internally, you were struggling with demons. And if somebody had been sitting there saying, hey, there's an easy way out, just sign these forms, you think you would have taken it.
Yeah, and that's been the part of it. It wasn't just you that I had a loose acquaintanceship with at the time. Even my own parents had no idea what I was dealing with, and I was very close to them, and I was living at home at the time, and people close in my life did not know what I was going through. This was a very private, personal struggle, and because of medical privacy, you could actually go through this process entirely on your own without anyone else, not just having input, but even have knowledge of it, and that's why I'm very concerned about the mental health expansion in particular, because, in my own story, there were several points at which I could have said, listen, I've fought this long enough. I've tried treatment. I've tried medication. I've tried therapy. I've tried all this and it wasn't working. And at a certain point, that was what I decided internally. Okay, I'm done now. I'm done. I scheduled the date that I was going to end my life on a calendar a few weeks out. I don't know why I scheduled it, but that was the way my mind worked at the time. And I, towards that point, had numerous opportunities to tell someone else, hey, you know what? This is not normal. This is not right. This is not healthy. But I didn't. I was that committed. And as I sort of tongue-in-cheek said in a video I did on this subject, I was that stubborn. But that's why I'm convinced that I would have navigated my way through the MAID process. Because, as you know, from my budding media career at the time, I was able to make an argument. I was able to present as being very in control. And that's what I would have done speaking with a MAID assessor in that process.
And so since then, you've gone on to build a career, build a life that you wouldn't have had otherwise. So just before we get into the legalities of all this and how we ended up here as a country, what would you say to people who are looking at this and saying, yeah, I can't wait for this?
My heart breaks when I hear that. And even in the course of the last few days, now that I've been talking about this, people have said that. And, I hate the cliches of, the light at the end of the tunnel and whatnot. But what I can say is that I had told a number of people when I was going through my struggles that tried to tell me, oh, things are going to get better. No, they won't. No, they won't. I'm 100% convinced they won't. They can't. And then they did. And I know it's a cliche when you try to tell someone who's struggling that there is a way through it, but there was. Like, I was 110% convinced that what I was living through was permanent, and that was why I was better off dead than alive, because there was no surviving, there was no thriving, and I did. And again, there are people, and I don't want to be inconsiderate to this, there are people for whom mental health challenges will be with them their entire lives. But even those people, we know countless stories of those who have learned to live with them and lived very well with them. So just because something is with you doesn't mean it has to be this life sentence, which is what I'm terrified the MAID expansion is going to normalize.
Did we end up at this point due to court orders, or have we gone well beyond what the courts have prescribed? Because at various turns, it's been a mixture of uh, legislators, such as yourself, people who sit in Parliament saying, well, we need to do this to help these people. And other times it's been the court saying, well, no, now that you've opened this door, you can't close it to other people. So how are we ending up that people who have, I do not want to minimize mental health issues, but again, this was sold to us for people who were dying of horrific cancer and
Mhm.
other horrible disease. I'm trying to think, Lou Gehrig's disease, or things that would rob them of their ability. That's what we were sold MAID on. Is this would help those people end their lives rather than going through excruciating physical pain. And now, we've had veterans who have been offered MAID
Mhm.
countless times. And, I've interviewed them on the Full Comment podcast and elsewhere. People who are just reaching out for help and saying, I'd like some help. And they're like, well, have you considered MAID? How did we end up at this point where we're going to say that any mental illness that you're dealing with could be bulimia, could be anorexia, could be depression, and we're going to say, have you considered MAID? How did we get there?
So it's actually a really, really concerning development that happened. So there was a Quebec court decision, Truchon, which basically said that Canada's MAID criteria were too restrictive. So the Liberal government didn't appeal that. They responded to it with legislation. Mental illness was never on the table. It was the Senate, the unelected senators in the last parliament, who decided they were going to change the criminal code which had specifically excluded people whose sole underlying condition was a mental illness, and make it so that mental illness itself would be a qualifying condition. And when the Senate did that, they kicked it back to the House of Commons, and there was this huge uproar about it from civil society, from mental health advocates, from the medical field, from disability rights activists. But the Liberal government, and at the time David Lametti, the Justice Minister, decided to accept it and passed the bill with the amendment. So this never actually went through the traditional process on this, and was never called for by anyone, and in fact has been derided by people who are not just your typical skeptics on MAID, people in the mental health space, Indigenous leaders, disability rights groups. All of these people have been very clear that we should not expand MAID to people with mental illness. And I'll just share with you, Brian, and I know this given my own struggles very intimately. If a doctor or nurse or social worker finds out that someone wants to end their life, that triggers a legal and ethical responsibility on their part to step in and ask some follow-up questions and actually ensure that person will not do that. And if they are going to, there's a mechanism in any province to commit them to protect their life. There is no ability that has been provided on how a mental health worker or any healthcare worker is supposed to distinguish between someone who is seeking suicide as a government service through MAID versus someone who is tripping that radar, where the state and the healthcare field has a duty to intervene to protect them. And this is one of the most glaring issues when you
Hold
allow
on.
people with mental illness to seek MAID.
If I, my doctor finds out that I plan on swallowing a bunch of pills or taking the shotgun out behind the woodshed, they have a legal responsibility to step in. But now there's no legal responsibility to say, have you considered the options? Maybe think about something else. That's just gone.
Well, this is the concern, and this is where nobody really knows. And just on process alone, the way this came into effect should concern people because normally we figure out all of these details and then we pass a law. In this case, the government passed the law and said we'll figure out the details later. They've had to delay the implementation date because they don't know how to do this, and now it's 2027. So that's an aside, but still a problem here. But if I go into a doctor's office and say, "Doctor, I'm depressed. I want to end my life," is that doctor now supposed to say, "Hang on, let's get you some help here," or are they going to say, "Oh, here's some pamphlets"?
I don't want to make this partisan because I know there are people in all parties who take different views on this. But you mentioned David Lametti, and he was Justin Trudeau's justice minister you know, as this went through, as you described. But he's now the principal secretary to the prime minister. I'm not sure that Mark Carney would agree with where the government has gone on this. He has a different mindset in some respects than the previous prime minister, and therefore this current government would have some different aspects. But I do worry about someone like David Lametti, who I consider fairly radical on many things, that he's part of it. Give a pitch for people who are, on the other side of the aisle. Give me your elevator pitch for why they should reconsider this, why the law should be changed, and why your colleague Tamara Jensen's private members bill should be adopted, and say, no, look, we're going to protect people, or at least put in more guardrails. I mean, one of the things that we keep hearing is we put in MAID with guardrails and now we've taken them off. And think about going down a highway and you're going along the highway and it's fine, but then you get to a really steep decline. You're going down the hill fast and there's a curve at the end and there's no guardrails. That's kind of where we're at with MAID, in my view, right now. So give me the elevator pitch for putting those guardrails back in and getting us back to what the original intention was.
So this is, I think, not at all a partisan issue, and I hope it's not. When Bill C-314 in the previous Parliament, which was an Ed Fast bill seeking to do the same thing, which is stop the mental health expansion for MAID, went forward, it had support from the entire Conservative caucus, the entire NDP caucus, the entire Green caucus, and several Liberal MPs individually. There were about 8 of them, and it was just shy of I think, maybe a dozen or so votes that it didn't pass. Bill C-218, which is the bill ahead now, I'm hoping will have similar support from the Conservatives, the NDP, the last Green MP, Elizabeth May, and I would love to see the Liberals. And to do the math on this, if all of those parties support this bill, 20 Liberal MPs will make the difference. So 20 Liberal MPs support this will pass. So I'm hoping people from all parties will come together and realize that this is about protecting the vulnerable. This is a bill that will legitimately save lives. The campaign that I've launched on this is called I Got Better. It's at igotbetter.ca. And I'll be sharing over the next few weeks and months stories that people are sending in about how they were so close to ending their own lives because they didn't think life could get better, and then it did. And I think those stories need to be shared with members of Parliament. I would encourage all Canadians watching this or reading this to contact their MP, whomever it is, and ask them to support Bill C-218, because this is something that I'm hoping all parties will allow a free vote on. But I cannot underscore enough that this will save lives, this bill. It is not partisan at all. And the calls from civil society, from activists on this, are coming from left and right. This is not at all a partisan piece of legislation.
Yeah. No, and nor should it be. I only raised it because of Lametti's involvement in both sides. I've spoken to Liberals who are aghast at this, who think this is the wrong direction. Unfortunately, the courts have pushed us in some ways, but in other ways, as you say, it's the Senate or various groups. So, Andrew, thanks so much for sharing your story with this. I saw your launch of it last week and said, well, I've got to reach out to him and talk to him about this. I'm very glad that, you did get better and that we have you now as an MP and as a voice out there, not on just on this subject, but on so many others. So thank you for your story. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Brian. Always a pleasure.
All right. Let me know what you think about this issue. Drop a comment down below. Share this on social media. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel.